I'm Lee Hamilton. I'm the president and director of the center. Today you will hear from both scholars and policymakers on one of the more important, if sometimes overlooked, questions of the day. Why is the U.S.-Russian relationship still important, and where is it going? Today's conference, convened by the Kettering Foundation, the International Institute for Sustained Dialogue, the International Center for Strategic and Political Studies in Moscow, in association with the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and History and Public Policy program, will provide you with important perspectives on this issue. I want to add a personal note of commendation to Hal Saunders, who has had an extraordinary career. Hal and I go back, it's hard to believe, Hal, more than 40 years when we worked together on Middle East issues, he in the State Department and I in the Congress. Over the years, I have benefited enormously from his encyclopedic knowledge of several questions and from his wise counsel. And what a marvelous second career he has had after leaving the State Department. In his work with the Kettering Foundation, he has done so much to promote and champion dialogue and peaceful resolution of disputes. I will turn the microphone over to him in just a moment. This conference commemorates the 50th anniversary of the Dartmouth Conference. The Dartmouth Conference is the longest continuous dialogue between American and Soviet, now Russian, citizens. 50 years ago this week, 10 Soviet citizens and 17 Americans sat down at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, for a week-long exchange largely reflecting their concern for preventing nuclear war. I understand that a Dartmouth task force focusing on the Russian-U.S. relationship met this past weekend, and that was the 130th meeting held under the Dartmouth umbrella over these turbulent 50 years. That's a remarkable achievement by any standard. All of us are acutely aware of the quiet, behind-the-scenes role that citizens outside government can play in the most contentious of relationships. Of course, there are many things that only governments can do, but it's always seemed to me, and perhaps to you as well, that citizens have their own important contribution to make. No matter how bad relations are between two countries, engaging adversaries, starting dialogue is essential. And there are instances when private citizens can jumpstart a dialogue in situations in which governments may have a harder time communicating. You do not know people and cultures and motivations and fears and ambitions unless you talk to others. It may take years to develop, as it did with the Soviets, a reliable and sustained dialogue. Going back many years, I can remember parliamentary exchanges between the Congress and the members of the Supreme Soviet. Year after year, we would come together, read speeches to each other, toast each other afterwards for peace, prosperity for our grandchildren, and go home. And that kept going year after year after year after year. And then things began to change. The speeches were put aside, and we began to talk with one another. For me, at least, that was the beginning of the thaw. Citizens track to diplomacy, indeed, the Dartmouth process, play a critical role. Dartmouth has been unique over this half-century of momentous change in providing a sustained space for communication between two great powers, even during the darkest moments of their Cold War rivalry. The Wilson Center shares with you this drive to sustain dialogue between communities and across cultures. In that spirit of common purpose, I welcome you today to this center, commend you as you celebrate Dartmouth Conference's important role in history. My pleasure now to turn the microphone over to Hal Saunders. Hal?
Thank you, Lee. That was a perfect keynote. I just have to say that, as Lee mentioned, we worked together in some of the darkest hours of the Arab-Israeli peace process and other challenges in the Middle East. Lee Hamilton, for me, is one of two people that I have known in public life for whom I use the name Mr. Integrity. He is straightforward. You can always count on him to do what he says he's going to do. He's fair. He can give you a very hard time in a hearing, such as, why aren't you talking to the Palestinians? But he never took it beyond the realm of decent inquiry and necessary investigation of an administration's point of view. So I might say that we hope that you will enjoy, as you step down ultimately from your post here, that you will enjoy and I don't know what to say. Is this the 9th career, 10th career, whatever? But anyway, we thank you so much for all that you have done for America in your many different roles. And we're grateful to be here with you today. And for me personally, to have you introduce this is a wonderful, wonderful moment. Thank you, Lee. We're also, of course, grateful to the Wilson Center as an institution and to the Kennan Institute and its colleagues for helping us to put this together. I would particularly like to call attention to and give thanks to my Russian partners in this, the Russian Center for Strategic and Political Studies, Dr. Vitaly Naumkin and Dr. Irina Zvigelskia. Over the last 25 years, we have increasingly become partners, and we live in each other's pockets much of the year when we do these things together. So thank you, Vitaly and Irina. Today we pay tribute to those courageous, far-sighted individuals who came together, as Lee said, at Dartmouth College 50 years ago this week. When they sat down together, nuclear war was not unimaginable. And I think one of the achievements of the 50 years has been that nuclear war has never been fought. We can't claim that Dartmouth was responsible for that, but Dartmouth certainly played a role. So we meet in tribute to those and to the many others, many of you in this room, who have carried the Dartmouth tradition forward through these years. And as Lee said, it is very much alive today with our 130th meeting just over this past weekend. My task here really is to give you a sense of the overview of today's meeting. I take my text from Yevgeny Primakov. In 1982, the first meeting of the Dartmouth Regional Conflicts Task Force took place at one of the cities in the Golden Ring outside Moscow. After 2 or 3 meetings of bringing the same people back together over and over again, we realized that we had some opportunities here. And Yevgeny pointed out that we had the opportunity to create a cumulative agenda. That is, questions left unanswered at the end of one meeting would be worked on between meetings and would become the agenda for the next. As he put it, we will start the next meeting where this one ended. And so we have today, in the Dartmouth tradition, a cumulative agenda. Just one other point in by way of introduction, in line of Lee's comments about the role of citizens, Dartmouth was in many ways prescient, forward-looking, recognizing that there were many problems, of course, that only governments can resolve, but there are also many problems that governments are not very good at resolving, and one of those is developing human relationships. I might say also transforming conflictual human relationships or changing political culture. So Dartmouth was a recognition of that in its way and far ahead of its time. By the 1980s, Kettering Foundation and others came into the recognition, yet this is very important, and so now we take it somewhat for granted, although I would say that governments are still not very good at engaging in the kind of dialogue that Lee and I are talking about. Now to today's agenda. In that spirit of recognizing that a major international relationship of this importance and of this potential for conflict, this kind of relationship needs a constituency. The Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, our ambassador in Moscow, both in our last meeting with them in Moscow last spring, said, what can you contribute to building a constituency for this relationship? We are going to start our day by asking, how do citizens think and talk about this relationship? And we're going to do so in ways that we'll start with a video showing citizens talk to each other, but we have here a panel of people who have been engaged in conducting public forums on the relationship over the last decade. So how do citizens think and talk about the relationship? The second panel will say to itself, okay, if that's the kind of relationship that citizens will support, what are the implications of that for the policymaker? What are the implications of that for the conduct of a relationship like this? Then at lunchtime, we will hear two talks. David Matthews will reflect on Kettering's research into the role of citizens in a major international relationship, and Dan Yankelovich will address the question of public judgment in public policy. After lunch, we'll turn a bit more toward those who have had professional experience in conducting the relationship. And in the first panel after lunch, this subject will be, all right, if this is the kind of relationship that we see, how do you conduct it in such a way as to build a public constituency for it? And of course, how do you conduct it in such a way as to avoid conflict between the two powers, and in such a way as to build a collaboration which has genuine power in the collaboration in addressing problems of world peace, of world development, that only more than one nation can address. So that's the third panel. How do you conduct a relationship in a way that produces a real relationship that has power on the world stage for good? And then finally, at the end of the day, we'll ask ourselves, where is the relationship going? What is its potential for contributing in this globalizing world to a genuine bilateral contribution to meeting the challenges that the world faces? So with that, I'm going to turn the chair over to the first panel, to Phil Stewart. Has been involved in Dartmouth since 1972. From 1972 to 90, he was in effect the executive director of Dartmouth on behalf of the Kettering Foundation, which has been the U.S. end of Dartmouth for these many years. And then he took leave of absence, without permission, I might say, to go and work with the Kellogg Corporation as its a senior manager in the former Soviet bloc, Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Did a phenomenal job there, and when they downsized, he came back and rejoined us, and he is now an associate of, senior associate of the Kettering Foundation, but also of the International Institute for Sustained Dialogue, which, in case you don't know, is a child of the Kettering Foundation. So, with no further remarks, I would like to turn this over to Phil and his team. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you very much, Hal. It is a great pleasure to be here with you this morning at this opportunity to celebrate 50 years of dialogue. Imagine that. That's as more than half of any one of our lives. I can say that safely. And more than the entire life of many of my younger colleagues. That's a great achievement. And it speaks particularly to me, that achievement, having just come off a remarkable 130th meeting this weekend out in the lovely hills of Virginia. Our Russian colleagues who participated are here with us, and I think we would all agree that we have demonstrated a capacity to work together, to achieve things together, as illustrated by the fact that without great ado, we were able to identify several key recommendations and innovative ideas to present jointly to both of our governments, and which we did to our government yesterday. But as Hal said, governments do what governments do. Citizens may contribute ideas, but unless there is a citizen constituency, we know in a democracy a line of policy, a relationship cannot long be sustained. We face an upcoming ratification of the START agreement. We face Russia joining the World Trade Organization. There is still the issue of Georgia unresolved and threatening new eruptions. Where is the public on these issues? Is there a capacity, a potential to build a relationship? We're going to address each of those questions this morning in 2 sessions. In our first session, we have brought together people who have been studying this issue for a long time, for at least 10 years. Actually, in the case of Dennis and Igor, for 20 years. In the case of John and Brad, even longer. This has been a joint effort stretching across countries, across oceans, and I think has produced some remarkable results. How is this work done? In a minute, we're going to show you a video that is designed not to report on the forums, but to give you a feeling, if you've never been in a public deliberation, of what it feels like. This is not really a video of a single forum, however. Rather, it is a compilation that gives you a sense of the flavor of what happens in a forum. If you listen carefully, and we're going to ask you each to listen through your earphones because the actual text switches quickly back and forth from Russian to English when we put on the video. And we have full text in English and Russian so everyone can hear it. And it's important that you do because you will see Russians and Americans expressing their concerns, expressing their hopes, talking about how we might overcome those concerns and address and realize those hopes. That's what happens when small groups of citizens get together in a discussion that is moderated with a modest amount of structure. We have conducted 4 rounds of such forums in the last 10 years. The first round was in Russia and in America, asking the question of what should our relationship be with the other side. Even 10 years ago, some 10 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had a great difficulty attracting the attention of American citizens to that topic. By contrast, in Russia, as Dennis and Igor traveled throughout the entire territory of the Russian Federation, their meetings were always full, and they held over 200 of them. That's a disparity that we will examine and address. We then spent several years focusing on 2 problems that each of our countries face to see what we could find in common and where we might work together to address some of these questions. They are questions that continue to trouble each country. Immigration. Russia and America face the largest wave of immigration in this century of any countries in the world. Russia has large numbers of immigrants, millions of immigrants from former Soviet states coming to Russia because there is work. And we have a similar situation in the United States, but from different sources. And the second issue was that of ethnic issues. How do we deal with those who are different from us? And this shed a great deal of light on how we might deal with each other, because in some ways, important ways, we are different from each other. Then in this last round, we focused the question on, more broadly, what do citizens feel our role in the world should be? Where should we focus? Where should our priorities be? In the United States, we asked, well, I'm going to let my colleagues talk about what we asked, but we focused on that question. All right, enough for me. You have the bios of my colleagues, John Doble from Public Agenda, Igor Nagdasev from the Center for Citizenship Education in St. Petersburg, Denis Makarov from the Foundation for Citizenship, no, you tell me, for the Development of Civic Culture, and Brad Rourke, who is a writer for the Kettering Foundation, a blogger, the most famous blogger in the Washington area of Maryland, as I understand it, and one who has followed and written about and written the issue books for public deliberation for a number of years. So let us jump right in and show this video. Igor is the producer of this video, and so that's his remarks, at least for the opening statement in his video. No, I think, well, yeah, why don't we do that? Put on the earphones if you have it, so that you can, the sound is very low in the room, so you can hear the
До тех пор, пока россияне будут себя чувствовать виноватыми в чем-то перед мировым сообществом, трудно нам рассчитывать на то, что нас будут уважать.
Yeah, I think Russia sees us as a threat, particularly since this whole focus of U.S. on terrorism rather than on terrorists.
Отношение простых американцев такое же, наверное, как и наш. Никто ведь воевать не хочет.
А можем ли мы положиться на Америку, и она положиться на нас в трудный момент?
If we don't put priority on them right now, helping them out and providing whatever resources and help that we can, we're going to be off their map when they have the power to help us or to assist us in relations. So I think that they need to be a very high priority.
И, в общем-то, все, в принципе, как бы мировые конфликты, они вот как-то, видимо, непроизвольно, но как бы оттуда вот идут.
Well, then we have to worry about who's controlling the nuclear weapons. That's a great fear that has to be lurking in the backs of our minds.
Америка вот в связи с своей экспансией, как экономической, политической, заняла слишком сильную позицию в мире, очень сильную. И поэтому не считаться с ней нельзя.
When Russia does well, the world is going to do well, because this is a huge country with huge resources.
Когда мы были, как говорится, в Советском Союзе, была граница закрытого, помните, какое было у нас общество. На нас никто не влиял, и у нас как бы сформировался уже характер русского человека. Не было влияния Запада.
Russia is really more capable of taking care of its own than a lot of the other countries around the world.
Знаете, мне в последнее время нравится отношение американцев к понятию демократии, вот что они вкладывают в понятие демократия, потому что сейчас, когда мы очень много перенимаем у Запада, вот у Америки, то вот многие стали принимать демократию как вседозволенность какую-то.
I would like to see not a president for life, maybe over there. I would like to see a free press, free TV, meaning not run by the state.
И Америка за свои 200 лет нас убедила, что она действительно не хочет жить при пожизненном президенте, что она строго придерживается одного закона: 2 срока и умри, 3-го срока не бывает, наследников по престолу тоже не бывает. И люди привыкли к этому, и люди постепенно пришли, что это хорошо, что когда человек имеет возможность выбрать президента, которого он хочет.
И у американцев есть план по скупке Сибири и Дальнего Востока. И уже конкретно разработан. То есть это конкретно. Я читал в газете.
We have a lot of work to do right here at home.
Дело в том, что Америка хотя бы в каких-то сферах и в последнее время тенденция увеличивается, все-таки нуждается в России. То есть, во-первых, у нас она нуждается в наших специалистах во многих сферах жизни. То есть вот эта вот перекачка мозгов, она по-прежнему продолжается, и нельзя сказать, что она идет на спад.
At that time, over 50% of our engineers and scientists that we use and employ in this country are foreigners. And he was saying, I have scholarships, for PhD scholarships, or graduate scholarships. I cannot give them to American citizens. I end up having to give them to foreign students because we don't have enough American people that are interested enough to go out for PhD in engineering or science.
Она как бы вкладывает деньги в нашу экономику, в наше образование, в культуру, но какие цели она преследует истинные, мы не знаем.
Economically, they have a lot to offer as far as a market for our products, our goods, our services. And, we're at a college here, and we have students that are going on to the job market, and I think a thriving Russian marketplace is good for their future.
I think any relationship we have with Russia at the moment threatens the United States, individuals from mafia-type operations, business mafia-type operations.
Если к нам пришли, мы же считаемся на сегодняшний день по их классификации страной с рискованной экономикой, с большим риском для инвестиционных проектов. Если они к нам приходят, если они нам протягивают руку, вкладывают в наше производство, в том числе и деньги, причем иногда и в долгосрочные проекты, значит, надо просто пытаться выравниваться в некоторых местах.
So do we want a strong Russia? Absolutely. Do we want a strong Russian economy? Absolutely. But what's the underlying motive that we have? Is it because we want to be a good neighbor? No. It's because it's security. If they're economically viable, if they're stable, then we don't have to worry about them.
Кого можно бояться? Сытого человека в прекрасном жилище, чистой постели, так сказать, прочее. Он добрый, как правило, или полуголодный, полупьяный русский мужик.
China and Russia may be more of an economic threat than they are any kind of military.
В смысле экономики между нами пропасть. И Америка, она пользуется этим, она давлеет над нами.
They too don't want us stepping in, telling them and saying this is the way it should be done, or this, if you want to do business with us. We have to wait until they and their people, it has to come from their people, really, which their government.
Мне не очень хочется, чтобы, конечно, нашей стране указывал кто-то, та же самая Америка, что делать, влиял на нее. Но, с другой стороны, я считаю, что нам не нужен никакой железный занавес. Нужен кто-то, чтобы кто-то контролировал нашу власть, потому что в настоящее время мы эту власть нашу контролировать просто не можем.
Я считаю, что один из главных признаков равнодушия является молчание. Молчания сегодня было мало. Значит, и 2,5 часа прошли недаром. А если мы не будем равнодушны друг к другу, значит, мы будем сотрудничать, мы будем понимать, мы будем знать. А это, считаю, на данном этапе развития общества главное.
I don't think we can make magic happen without lots of one-to-one human relationships. That's my take on it.
Well, I hope that gave you some sense of and that you could all hear well through the translations, of what happens in a forum. And you can see that all ages, all generations, and people of very diverse backgrounds took part in these discussions. Now we're going to begin to get some sense of the substance of where do each of our experts feel that our public is on the basis, in terms of the relationship, on the basis of the numerous forums that have been held over the past 10 years. I'm going to ask each one to speak for no more than 7 minutes, and I will interrupt them, and I will warn them at 5 minutes. What I've asked them to do is to put on the table their key points, and then we will have a discussion among us, and we will allow plenty of time for your questions. So as questions arise in your mind as you hear the presentations, please take a note, and we will be happy to entertain those questions. So let us begin on our left with John Doble. I'm sorry, no, we should begin with historically. Actually, Brad is going to talk about the early period, the early rounds, and Dennis and Igor actually will cover their entire period. So we want to begin with Brad, and then we'll go to Dennis, and then we'll go to John. Okay.
Thank you, Phil. I appreciate that because this is the piece I'm prepared to speak about rather than the later. So I'm glad we're going in this in this direction. And I think you might have misspoke. I believe you meant to say I'm the least famous blogger in DC, but everything else was accurate. Hal and Phil laid out a wonderful, quintessentially Dartmouthian cumulative agenda for the day, and the concept of a cumulative agenda is a wonderful one, and I particularly like it because that I'm going first, which means that the points I need to lay on the table are really quite basic, because the more nuanced points will come after me. So in many ways, my job is quite easy, and I appreciate that, so thank you. I'm going to talk about some findings from the early part of the decade, specifically the 2001 through 2003 time frame, when a number of deliberative forums were held, as we've heard, both in Russia and the U.S., and to a certain extent, I'll talk about some findings on the Russian side, because what is interesting, I think, to lay on the table is a divergence between U.S. views of themselves and of Russia, and Russian views at the time of themselves and the U.S. So I'll focus more on U.S., but I will speak to some extent about Russia. And please remember, this is to give us an early in the decade data point off of which we will build. So this is as things were in 03 and proceeding. It's important to note that as you saw from the video, the excellent video, I might add. That these findings emerge from not from direct surveys of a representative sample of citizens, but out of dialogue in small groups, and so our sense is, and my belief is that it's at once a more nuanced look at where people's minds are at on the subject. But also, it's important to note that we're making no claims to broad representation. That said, 2,500 citizens in more than 100 forums certainly is not something to be discounted in any stretch of the imagination. And an understanding of what we hear doesn't necessarily need to dictate, nor can it dictate policy, but it can lay the groundwork for what are the parameters within which our governments can work. So I want to place on the table really 2.5 points about this, and they relate to findings about where people's minds were at as regards identity, as regards their sense of the interests of their respective nations, And finally, the half point, which is in fact perhaps the most important one, is looking forward at the possible power of a relationship between the U.S. and Russia. First, as regards identity, for many Russians in this period, the prevailing view, at least based on what we saw, was Russian is a great power that once was a superpower, and the Russian self-identity on an individual level or a cultural level is of a people who are highly interdependent, focused on their social networks, and by this I mean their real social networks and not their Facebook pages, because this is early in the decade. And the view of U.S. citizens was Americans are very businesslike. That's a quote from the forums. Well, Russians are kind-hearted. He saw the U.S. as highly self-reliant and to a certain extent unilateral, and that we act solely on the basis of our own interests. Compare this to the U.S. self-identity, which is Americans are not known for being highly introspective, but when pushed to think about it, Americans saw themselves as compassionate and cautious, and highly concerned with not seeming arrogant, and highly concerned with not seeming unilateral. As one participant put it in thinking about aid to Russia, this person said, who are we to help when we have similar concerns? Russians are a proud people and they may not respond well to aid. More to the point is I believe the difference in the strength of the self-identity and the identity of the other. Russians in these forums found it relatively easy to describe what they saw as the identity of Americans, whereas Americans found it very difficult to describe what they saw as the identity of Russians. It was hard to put their finger on it. So that's one asymmetry. The second asymmetry has to do with the interests of our relative nations. In the Russian forums during this period, Russians sought cooperation with the U.S., as they put it, as one person put it, to defend peace, to struggle against crime, and to preserve the environment, approaching the relationship as an equal partner. On the American side, U.S. citizens saw a different purpose for such a relationship. One participant said, maintaining allies like Russia is important for economic and political reasons. The stakes in the relationship in the minds of the American citizens was certainly not as high as it was when the Russian citizens thought about it. Russia wanted to approach the U.S. on an equal footing, whereas the U.S. didn't seem to, U.S. citizens by and large did not think to reciprocate. One of the keys here is that the purpose of that relationship is indirect in the mind of the American during this period. Russians said before entering into a relationship, they needed to have military and economic parity. The U.S. U.S. citizens were less concerned with the nation and more concerned with the people, and said we need to get to know them first. And in the end, that's the core asymmetry that I want to put on the table. The Russian view of the relationship during this period appears to be quite nuanced and quite rooted in a sense of nation. The emblematic comment is that there is a certain underlying bitterness in each of our countries with respect to one another, said one Russian. Our relations are complicated by the history of the Cold War. Contrast this with the sense on the American side that, which was much more blunt and much less nuanced, well capsulated by this comment from an American: we should trust and verify. If we find them trustworthy, okay, but we need to be cautious. And I think that very well describes at that point the sort of the main asymmetry to put on the table when it comes to how Russians were looking at both the U.S. and at a relationship, and how American citizens were looking at the possibility of a relationship, and more importantly, at the citizens of the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brad. I should note, in introducing Dennis and turning it over to Dennis, that he has been following this relationship and public thinking in the relationship on a continuous basis, and able to draw some trend lines, and I know he will talk to us. So it makes a very good link from the past. He's the one who did all of these forums together with Igor in the early periods that formed the database from which Brad was able to draw. Dennis, please.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Brad. Now let's see how Russians perceive their future. And again, these are the outcomes of the public forum. These are not experts' opinions, neither governmental opinions. So public forums' opinions are quite different, but they do exist, and this is actually opinions of Russian majority. While doing the forums on possible Russian role in the nearest future, at least, we have observed at least 4 major strategies, 4 major choices that Russians prefer. I will go through all of them. So the first choice, and we call it strategy number 1, called Russia a superpower. Statement behind, and again, all the strategies and statements were formulated in a simple language, so average Russian, every average Russian could understand it. And the statement behind the strategy called Russia a superpower is the following one. Russia has lost her respect along with her greatness and power in the world. She can be either a great power or disappear. A third option doesn't exist. Strong Russia will be capable to combat any crisis, to solve domestic and global issues. The second strategy was called First Among Equals. Statement: to pretend to some exclusive rights or to escape into a shell are extremes in a multipolar world. Russia has to seek equality and partnership with leading world powers, and that will further help her to jointly overcome any crisis and to solve global issues. Strategy number third strategy was called isolationism, concentrate on domestic issues. The statement: Russia has its special way and its special mission, but integration into the world economy was imposed on her, and that made Russia dependent upon global prices and crises. Isolationism might help the nation become self-sufficient again, to solve domestic issues and to make people live better. And finally, the fourth strategy was called Learn from the best of the world community. The statement: a weak Russia, whose economy depends on natural resource trade only, cannot be an equal partner, and especially a world power today. At that point, Russia is faced with necessity to sustain a pause, while learning and adopting from the policies of the most successful nations on the planet. And we have been capable of observing these strategies for a dynamic of how the public thoughts where they were going to over the last 12 years. So let's go again through the strategies and see where we're up to now. Russia is a superpower. Russians are slowly but gradually moving from former global ambitions to regional ones. As before, a superpower is, first of all, nostalgia for the feeling of power and respect for the USSR, but secondly, a method of possible resistance to military political expansion of the West into the zone of vital interest of Russia. But if earlier it was mainly the USSR that was the example and image of a superpower, today the model created by the United States seems more appealing. However, the presence of China is more and more felt in the audience as a possible example of the superpower for Russia in the nearest future. Nevertheless, superpower ambitions and claims of Russians gradually decrease owing to both the weakening of the emotional and nostalgic components, and owing to rationalization of consciousness and the more adequate evaluation of the modern Russian state. It can be said that foreign policy realism is replacing ambitions, emotions, and nostalgia more and more. Regarding the second strategy, I will remind it's first among equals. Strategy number 2 used to reflect the integration sympathies of Russians. In the 90s, these sympathies were oriented to the United States and Western Europe, and after 1999 Kosovo crisis, to a great extent to the European community. The tendency pointed out by us in the course of the current discussion campaign shows that sympathy for strategies of integration are basically declining in Russia, and in the Western direction even more. The major factors in these are both an increasing distrust and fear of economically and militarily stronger states, and the more adequate evaluation of the possibilities of modern Russia. It should be added that strategy number 2 received the least support among the participants of the forums. Strategy number 3, isolation, to concentrate on domestic issues. Isolationist tendencies, in contrast to similar ones at the beginning of the current century, have quite seriously gained weight in the course of the recent forums. I'm speaking about 2009 forums. However, this is not the isolation of the Iron Curtain. Quote, today's concept is a selective isolation, for example, reflected in the following rather long statement of one of our participants. Complete isolation will never do. We should take 50% of this strategy and isolate partially. For example, oil and gas traders should be obliged to leave 50% of oil in the country according to the law, and its price will in no way depend on the world prices, as it will be meant as a priority only for home market. Then the price in Russia will depend on the purchasing capacity of Russians and not on the purchasing capacity in the European Union or on the OPEC decisions. Then, when our industry works, we will be able to completely end our dependence on raw material and sell goods and oil refined products. A curious observation in that average age of advocates of isolation, even if only partial isolation, has become younger. We explain it by the fact that the principles of isolationism for an older generation were based on the examples from the Soviet past, while the youth today are more guided by economic and pragmatic consideration when speaking about isolationism approach. Finally, strategy number 4, to learn on the best experience of the world community. Never before was the strategy suggesting learning and borrowing of external experience valued so highly as in the course of 2009 public forums. In the previous periods of research, typical of counter-arguments to the strategy sounded, for example, like these two statements by participants of the current forums. Quote, this is utopia, as the mentality of the Russian people is such that it will not be able to live like Western countries, unquote. Or, quote, we have a different mentality, we won't be able to learn from the others. We are used to live all and always on the off chance, unquote. Quote, we have such a turn of mind, we leave everything for the last day, the last hour, the last minute, unquote. References to the peculiarities of mentality and in general to oneness as the excuse why Russians cannot do this or that are characteristic of all 12 years of observations, but their number is gradually decreasing. Besides, if earlier oneness had a plus sign, today at separate forums we observed a skeptical, critical, or even ironic perception of oneness by many of our participants. That's basically the dynamics of the thoughts, but it is also interesting to see how Russians feel about the threats and what are their major concerns. And the same as within the US forums, the major concern, of course, for all of us, and especially after September 11, are concerns of security. So what is security? What means security for Russia in the global arena? Non-surprisingly, the list of security threats and issues was divided by participants in two different fields. The so-called external securities and internal securities. The list of external securities includes aggressive from the point of view of Russia foreign policy of other countries, military blocs and alliances in which Russia does not participate, financial and economic security, exploitation of raw material resources of the Russian Federation, commodity food expansion, disrespect in the surrounding world, and problem of mistrust of Russia. If the forum participants in previous years did not think about the fact that not only the United States and NATO could pose a serious threat to the security of Russia, but say Russian corrupt functionaries, such thoughts sounded in 2009, especially after the start of the global crisis. Among, quote, internal threats, unquote, related to Russian foreign policy, i.e. those internal problems which so-called enemies of Russia, wherever they are, can use in their interest, in the first place, citizens mentioned the following ones. An efficient and non-transparent work of Russian authorities in general, vulnerability in military defensive aspect, lack of self-sufficiency, commodity and food security, dependence on world prices for goods and resources, narrow raw material orientation of the economics, excessive foreign policy, global and regional ambitions of Russia, corruption as a social, political, and economic phenomena, disrespect for the people by the authorities and disregard of their interests and needs, disrespect for individual rights, freedoms, and law in the society in general, unhampered exodus of intellectual and qualified specialists from Russia, lack of a stable national identity, and de facto lack of a national idea, the purpose and meaning of existence, lack of moral reference points of development and the collapse of morals, inclusive social aggressiveness, indistinct educational and youth policies, and resting on the glorious past with a lack of any clear present and clear future. And in the conclusion, let me mention just 4 last points. What forum participants seem to want for Russia is a constituted process and not the political announcement of a new status for Russia according to one or another strategy or related to particular event in Russian politics, such as war with Georgia, for example, in 2008. A thorough discussion of the matter minimizes the role of hasty and emotional preferences. It's interesting that traditional conceptions of greatness, particularity or oneness, messianism as beneficial mission, and specific spirituality of the nation are subject to serious critical reconsideration. Many participants openly said that those conceptions about us had not only become out of date, but had also been an obstacle in adequate development of the present consciousness and identity of Russians. Comparing the current and the previous forum campaigns over the last decade on the same and relevant issues, we have noticed a significant growth of critical judgments on contemporary, and not only on contemporary, Russian reality. We often had an impression, listening to the forums, that the main obstacles in the country's search for its global identity are conditioned by its own cultural and psychological features, by its political power institutions and their representatives' functioning, and by the status of our economy, agriculture, education, and etc. Finally, if we will try to see what outline strategies got major and minor support among Russian majority, among citizens, we will see that surprisingly, year by year, the 4th strategy, let's learn from the best of the world community, is gaining weight year by year. And it's leading with 35.5%. Learn from the best of the world community, 35.5%. The second position is held by isolationist moods. Isolationism concentrates on domestic issues with 26.5%. Russia, a superpower in its new format, hold the 3rd position with 21.5%. And finally, integrationist concept, first among equal, gets the last place with 16.5%. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. We're going to, in our discussion, then ask, what are the implications of these stark differences. I think one of the powerful lessons that I draw from Dennis's analysis is that domestic events, culture, politics, economics in Russia has created create obstacles, in a sense, to a relationship, just as they do in our country. That is, domestic politics plays a profound role in Russia today. And I think Dennis has done a superb job of identifying the parameters of that, those perspectives and those elements of domestic politics as they shape Russian thinking about how to relate to the larger world. John Doble is one of America's distinguished social scientists working on, we've been working with public deliberation for maybe 30 years, and knows what he's talking about. This is not his first effort, but probably his 31st effort, creating an analysis of the results of forums. John.
Well, Phil, I will pick up exactly where you just left off at the end of my remarks, and where Dennis commented as well. But let me start by presenting you with a framework that I hope will help you understand what happened in this year's National Issues Forums in this country. Many of you are familiar with what I'm about to say, but for generations, the social scientists who studied public opinion across the world conceived of it as one-dimensional, somewhat like the temperature, something that could be pegged rather easily. About 25 years ago or so, Dan Yankelovich, who's with us today, made a striking discovery that public opinion, instead of being one-dimensional and something that's relatively easy to gauge, is in fact a process. It's more like a weather system than the temperature. Dan Yankelovich has discovered that, especially when it comes to complex public issues, there's a remarkable difference often between what people say initially and what they say when they have a chance to think about it, talk about it with their neighbors, deliberate about it, hear the trade-offs, and consider the issue at some length. Dan labels this the working through process, as people work through from their top-of-the-head opinion to a judgment. We saw exactly this phenomenon in these National Issues Forums on America's role in the world. We asked people in these forums, what does national security mean? And we gave them three possible definitions to deliberate about. The first one was that national security means safety. It means safety from an array of threats, safety from terrorism, safety from other military threats, such as from Iran and North Korea, but also from long-term adversaries such as Russia. A second possible definition was that safety means a strong economy, tackling a country's debt and bringing down unemployment. The third possible definition was that national security means addressing the common threats that threaten all of humanity, things like the environment, global warming, nuclear proliferation, pandemics, things like diseases such as HIV/AIDS. And for 2 hours, people deliberated about those three possible definitions. Their initial response, their top-of-the-head response, was that national security means safety. That's what that we need to be safe from terrorism, we need to be safe from threats such as Iran and so on. But as they deliberated, their more considered view was quite different. As they worked through, they said that national security depends first and foremost on this country having a strong economy, going right back to the point that Phil Stewart just made and that Dennis just made, that domestic events shape everything else related to foreign affairs. People said in the forums that unless we get the economy back on its feet, every other endeavor that this country embarks on, including our military security and its ability to deal with any other threat, will be compromised. Their primary concerns in the forums were the deficit and the debt, including the balance of trade, and unemployment, including the outsourcing of jobs. But there was also a good deal of talk about people's personal indebtedness and a culture that leads Americans to live beyond their means. And there was a lot of talk about China and the ascendancy of China as an economic rival. The third possible definition of national security, global threats that threaten all of mankind, were also deliberated about at length, and a large number of forum participants were concerned about them. They were especially concerned about environmental threats such as global warming. Others mentioned air and water quality, disease, nuclear proliferation, overpopulation, and there was a fair amount of talk about global peacekeeping, with particular focus on Iran and North Korea. But when people in the forums discussed how to deal with these threats, they strongly felt that international collaboration is required. They said that given this country's economic situation, the United States simply lacks the resources to handle such issues by itself. The United States can't go it alone anymore. In fact, in some forums, people suggested that the United States and Russia should work together on these kinds of threats, especially when it comes to nuclear proliferation and threats from countries like Iran. We could almost call this a kind of a window for collaboration that seemed to be open in these forums. But there were three obstacles, and this is the final point I'll make. There were three obstacles that emerged in these forums that could block collaboration from occurring, that could close or narrow the window. First, a great many people in the forums said that they had low confidence in international organizations such as the United Nations. They didn't really see mechanisms for the United States to get involved with other countries and tackle these kinds of issues. Second, a fair number of people in the forums volunteered that when it comes to international collaborative efforts, other countries won't do their fair share. The United States will have to shoulder the burden. American taxpayers, and if it's peacekeeping, American troops will have to shoulder the burden. Finally, it would seem, and I'm out on a limb a bit here, I'm drawing on my years of experience here, and I'm out on a limb a bit here, but it would seem as if people's willingness to participate in collaborative efforts depends in large part on the country's economic strength. If the U.S. economy recovers, if it recovers quickly, the window for collaboration may narrow or close. There will be less public support for collaborative efforts than there is at the present time. That's what the forum suggests.
Thank you very much, John. Let me ask Igor to begin our discussion. Igor, do you see a window of opportunity for building a public constituency from the forums you have held? Or do you tell me how you feel about that question? Because that's the core here that we're trying to explore. Is there a window of opportunity?
English, Russian?
Speak English as fine as you wish, or Russian, either one.
Okay, I'll go Russian.
Okay.
То есть вопрос заключался в том, что
есть окно возможностей сотрудничества, есть готовность поддерживать наше сотрудничество поглубже, да, по самым трудным вопросам.
Ну, на самом деле, если следить историю отношений России, вернее, историю восприятия взаимоотношений России и Америки за вот эти 10 лет, о которых мы здесь разговариваем, и на самом деле в наших исследованиях даже больший период, поскольку первые какие-то попытки мы делали еще в середине 90-х годов, то вот тот период изначальный, когда в России преобладали, в российском общественном мнении преобладали некие такие романтические представление об Америке. И Америка виделась в большей мере неким образцом для подражания, образцом для воспроизведения тех или иных взаимоотношений в обществе на российской почве, то вот за этот 10-15-летний период произошла очень такая очевидная эволюция движения вот этого романтического восприятия к очень прагматичным вещам. На сегодняшний день люди больше говорят о том, что говорят о каком-то равном партнерстве с Америкой. Если раньше все время шли оговорки, а мы не дотягиваем, то на сегодняшний день многие говорят о том, что следует сотрудничать, следует на равных взаимодействовать с Америкой. И другой момент – это то, что растут некие, скажем так, ну, я называю их для себя имперские амбиции в России, в российском общественном сознании. То есть желание утверждаться на постсоветском пространстве, желание утверждаться в каких-то регионах, которые раньше были значимы для Советского Союза. То есть в какой-то мере можно говорить, что на сегодняшний день многие россияне с ностальгией смотрят на советскую внешнюю политику и желали бы вернуться к ней. В этом отношении они открыты в большей мере, наверное, к диалогу с Америкой, но диалогу на более-менее таких равных, что ли, основаниях.
Thank you, Igor. So what I hear from you is that one critical dimension, and that is treating being treated equally, being treated as an equal partner. That there are counter pressures. There are what you're painting is a very complex picture of an emerging, more self-conscious society in which older preconceptions of glory and more pragmatic thinking are, in a sense, competing. How do you look at this, Dennis? Is there a window of opportunity?
There are two thoughts, my personal and public thoughts. So let's go to public thought because it's more important. Russians sincerely believe that the window is not closed, and their hopes are associated with glorious and prosperous Russia. There is a skepticism within the country, but still they hope to be a partner in various fields with the United States and Western Europe, at least if Russia will be a regional superpower. That's an impression I got while participating and doing and watching and observing these forums.
Do you want to share any of your personal views with us? This is, after all, a Dartmouth kind of discussion where we speak frankly and openly, but it's your choice.
You asked it.
I take accountability.
I personally do not perceive that ambitions to become a regional power are quite realistic.
Thank you. From the perspective of the longer study that you have looked at, what do you, if we say, okay, there's a window, what do you think is most important to build upon? What are the common interests or identity issues or capacity for achieving things together that can't be achieved alone that might become well springs for strengthening the potential for collaboration, for building on this window of opportunity?
Well, I'll speak most specifically on the U.S. side because there's an interesting arc from early in the decade to the report that John Doble just gave about where U.S. citizens are at now when it comes to the prospect of collaboration. And I think one way to look at early in the decade, the overall response to that question might have been, well, I guess we could collaborate. I guess that'd be an okay idea. So long as certain conditions were met and we could trust that the Russian folks would do what they're supposed to do. And what I heard in John's report, when reflecting on some of the global issues that are facing humanity, I heard a much more open view from on the part of the U.S. citizens, which is, as John put it, the sense that, well, certainly we need to collaborate on some of these issues. There's just no question about it. But there are obstacles. There are domestic obstacles that are in place, and I think that the ultimate answer to that question is rooted in a notion that John's put forward in other fora, that there may be a thin soil that's here now, and what it will depend on is the relative subsidence of our senses of economic weakness, and the relative upsurge in a sense of urgency about global threats that face not just the U.S. but humanity at large.
So you said, now, did I understand you correctly when you said that, maybe I'm interpreting, as our economy improves, do you expect to see greater interest in cooperation?
That's what I've heard us say up here today.
I heard John say the opposite. John, do you want to elaborate on why you feel that way?
Well,
did I get you opposite?
Brad, I had said the opposite. Let me say a couple of things. I'd like to go back to something Dennis said earlier, and it's kind of related to Brad's point. If I heard you correctly earlier, Dennis, it was words to the effect that in Russia, the traditional sense of greatness may be out of date, I think was the term you used, or declining, something along those lines. What we heard in the forums again and again and again, and what we've heard in other contexts, those of you who have studied public opinion have probably heard this again and again and again, is the sense that America's best days may be behind it, that we may be on a real decline, not a temporary decline. This may not be a recession that we're in or a great recession that we're in, but that we may really be declining in a real permanent way. I think in either case, it was the sense of economic decline, along with the sense that these global threats threaten all of us, that is pushing the momentum for cooperation.
So that could be a long-term factor then, if in fact these perceptions hold, if this recovery is very slow, and in fact people continue to feel that our best days are over, then we have a greater sense of a greater motivation for cooperating.
And if I may, Phil, just going back to picking up again on Dennis's point, if we return to the days where America feels that it is number one in the world, then that sense may diminish depending on the extent that people feel that the global threats are real, regardless of whether a country is a superpower. And I suspect, in the days when...
Okay, I'm going to stop our excellent conversation. I really appreciate this exchange. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your questions. Try to keep your questions short, although if you like to make a brief statement, I will tell you when brief has ended. Who would like to ask a question of the panel, or make an observation, or a brief statement? Please, we have a microphone right here because we're recording this discussion.
Для того, чтобы объединиться на основе оценки глобальных угроз, вот насколько все-таки сообщество обеих стран готово к общей оценке и к общим подходам глобальных угроз, с которыми сталкиваются наши страны?
Did you understand the question? Okay, who would like to respond?
Я думаю, что на сегодняшний день это нереально. поскольку точки зрения все-таки американцев и русских именно в оценке, возможно, даже как бы набор проблем, он примерно один и тот же, но вот на уровне общественного сознания оценка их совершенно разная.
On the other hand, I would add that while, as was shown in the Dartmouth meeting we just had, what a relationship consists of is not that we already agree, but that we recognize that we share a sufficient sense of identity or sufficient interest that we can work on our problems together. So to pose one particular problem that was, I'm not sure how much it affects the public, but it does affect sense of security. That's anti-ballistic missile defense. The United States for 25 years has been building a system that eventually, if it ever worked, would be a global anti-ballistic missile system. There has been a proposal by President Obama for a collaborative missile system. Russians feel very threatened by this, not by the collaborative, but by their absence from that. Now, this is something that is very, very difficult for Americans. It's difficult for Russians because it means giving up a lot of our stereotypes, our fears, right? That's what you're talking about. But it is, if we have the courage together to begin to work in this direction, have the patience to work through the emotions, those fears, those difficulties. Will I share this? Should I be open about that? We will gradually build a foundation that enables a real relationship to flourish. I think at an institutional and personal level, Dartmouth is a superb example of that. Our colleagues we have worked with for 20, 25, 30 years, there is not any question, either in our personal or our relationship lives, that we can't frankly and openly and fully exchange views on, even when we differ. That's what a relationship is, not agreement, but a capacity to work things through together. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, please.
I wondered when you gathered together the groups, whether you had many individuals who were in the 20s, maybe. And I'm curious about if there is some difference in their viewpoints from some of the older people. I mean, you're talking about holding on to the sense of greatness and returning to the past, but and then there was the emerging pragmatism. So I'm just curious about whether there are real differences in how the younger people view these issues.
Why don't we have Dennis answer briefly, and then John. Какие разницы между молодежь и более взрослыми людьми по поводу, основные вопросы отношений? То есть есть разница по генерации?
Speaking about differences in perceptions that youth has these days and all the generations, I would say that the difference was clear and vivid 10, 15 years ago, but now I believe the borders between perceptions are interlapping more and more. So it's not more about out-of-dated perceptions of older generations and not adult-like perceptions of younger generations. It's more about going from emotional to rational consciousness in Russia. And a recent global crisis revealed the weakness of the Russian state and society that mainly depend on oil prices. Technically, oil prices is the only national idea we have. While the oil prices are high, society flourishes, at least at major cities, at least on the television. While they're down, and the government looks incapable of combating with this problem, the society starts to think, and it's not that important who you are. An older generation guy or a young lady from the university, they start to think why it's happening, what's wrong. It's not some kind of an external threat. So I would say the consciousness in generally, as I said, gradually integrates to more rational forms where age is not that important as it used to be.
Let me add to
Go ahead,
that,
please, go ahead.
because speaking about our forums, which a little bit different than what Dennis did, the strongest anti-American statements coming from the people younger than 30 years old. So it's so the younger generation is more aggressive and less open to any kind of compromise in their statements.
John, what did you find?
I'll answer very briefly. The National Issues Forums, as Brad said initially, it's not a random or a national probability sample. So it's a deliberation of people who voluntarily come together, sometimes in educational settings, often in community settings or faith-based organizations and so on. So we hesitate to slice and dice the results, if you will, other than making the broadest generalizations. I would say, though, that broadly speaking, the younger people were more mindful of the global threats facing humanity than were the older people in the forums. And I really hesitate to go much beyond that because it's not a public opinion poll. It's a gathering of people who use a framework to deliberate with their neighbors for 2 hours and try to reach some kind of common ground or approach some kind of common ground for understanding. So it's a unique process.
I would add to that. I had the privilege of observing 2 forums this spring on the subject of America's role in the world. One in Panama City, Florida, where there are a lot of military active and retired people. You saw one clip from that, or several clips from that forum. And a forum of high school students in Beaver Creek, Iowa, the home of Roswell Garst, one of the initiators of warmer relations with the Soviet Union. And my observation tends to confirm what John said. The students were concerned about the economy, about their own future, but they looked more broadly. In contrast to Russians, if we ask about support for a better, more cooperative relationship, I think that cuts across generations. But we're going to talk more in the next session about one very interesting phenomenon. A number of those young high school students in Beaver Creek, Iowa, had Russian friends who live in the United States. And so that's something that when we talk about these things, we don't normally consider. In the early 90s, or in the early parts of this decade, when we held forums on the U.S.-Russia relationship, I also participated in a number of them, and many of them were, to many of those Russian citizens, or Russians who are probably now American citizens, were engaged in them. And so that's simply an added. Do we have one more question? Yes, ma'am. Oh, we have more questions. Wonderful. Let's hear them.
Thank you very much. Given that public opinion is in part formed by the tone set by our elected officials, I'd be really curious to hear your sense of the potential for the bilateral commission that Presidents Medvedev and Obama have established last year, the potential for that to help Russia and the U.S. make real cooperative progress addressing some of these critical issues we face, and in that process affect public support for the Russia-U.S. relationship.
I'll just make a brief observation. After the struggle in Georgia, within a month, we actually had 2 Dartmouth conferences, one with my colleagues here and others talking about our publics, and the second one immediately following at the more policy level. Immediately following that, or 3 months later, we had in December, when the relationship's probably their lowest, we had a meeting at which a number of the people in this room participated, in which we asked ourselves, how can we better create a structure for this relationship that can provide some long-term stability and some capacity to build active working relationships, not as Lee Hamilton suggested, just reading speeches, but in fact mutually working on problems. And we don't take credit. We did recommend such a commission. We don't take credit for it, but it did happen, and we're happy to see it in place. I'll let my colleagues comment on whether they think it can, what difference they think it can make. Any? No?
I don't have
Let me just say that yesterday we had a meeting in the two meetings in the State Department where we raised these questions, as well as meetings with senior staffers in Congress. And among the, we talked about this, among the commissions that exist is one on civil relations and activization of civil society. I heard a number of comments that are, I think, hopeful, particularly as I look over my many years of experience in trying to bring to the attention of governments, and not only mine, but Kettering Foundation experience, bring to the attention of governments what citizens have to say when they think seriously about issues. And generally it is, okay, thank you, yeah, bye-bye, don't bother me too quickly again, please. But now, we hear again and again, we need new ideas. We don't have all of the answers. Without a public constituency, without citizens ready to stand up and be counted, this relationship which we have worked so hard on and which shows so much promise, not just because it's a good thing in and of itself, because it will allow America to solve problems that she can't solve alone, depends upon a citizen constituency. So I think that is an open door to the government, and the government is, for example, we have with us here Dr. Evgeny Velikov, one of the world's distinguished physicists, who, just to show you he has lovely cufflinks signed by President Reagan in appreciation for the work that he has done in the fusion reactor and in other joint projects. And he is now secretary of the public chamber in Russia, which seeks to create in some way a capacity for citizens to both create a greater sense of themselves and their role as citizens, but to interact with government. And one of the things that attracted him to our meeting is precisely the opportunity to connect more deeply citizen thinking with official thinking. I'm going to take one more question, and then we're going to take a break. Someone else? You had a question right there. Yes, please.
Reference was made to the fact that the younger people in Russia today have more antipathy toward the United States and more questions about the feasibility of a solid, peaceful relationship than older people. What is it that is affecting the younger people, causing them to think that way?
Excellent question. Dennis? Dennis, Igor?
Две мысли по этому поводу. Честно говоря, okay. Two thoughts. The first one that probably it's just, age. So when you're younger, you prefer to think in a in a more categoric way, in a more exclusive way, in a more controversial way than when you're getting older and you start appreciating some kind of compromises. That's the first one. And the second one, I think that the Russian younger generation never get really exposed to a Western style of life, Western civilization. So they still, under current regime, they reproduce those stereotypes which used to be very common in a Soviet past. In some respect, younger generation are more Soviet than the middle generation in this respect.
You want to make a comment, Dan? He just has to make a comment.
No, I can add a couple of thoughts regarding why some younger thoughts might be radical in the current country. You see, the consciousness, depends on what is going on, and every young person at least young person need to know what's the purpose of his life, what's the purpose of the life of his country, of his peoples. Within this transformation period when everything was certain and the national idea was more or less framed within the perceptions on bright future of the communism, right now, at least in public opinion, at least on official way, nothing has been declared of where we're going to, what is the purpose of our country. If we would like to fight with Georgia or protect our national interests as Moldova, what's the purpose of this? What's the rational purpose of this? And when young consciousness is trying to find the answers of the general purpose of the society, it cannot find it. So, and when it cannot find it, it's stocked within the frames of official perception on everything, on what's on the television, on what's in newspaper. You saw this video and one guy said, I'm sure that these things are that and that. I just heard it, I just read it on the newspaper. So that's exactly within the thought I'm trying to express. No wonder that in number of forums, what Igor was doing, some youngsters appeared to be more radical than some older people, unfortunately.
I should say that Dennis is also a distinguished professor at the Moscow Pedagogical University who interacts with students on a daily basis as well. I want to first thank you for your questions, for your attention, and I want to thank each of the panelists for their excellent presentations and discussion. Thank you.